Hello and welcome to the IRDR Annual Conference, Risk Without Borders. I want to say a warm welcome to all of you to UCL, to the MAPS faculty and to the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, IRDR. It's really wonderful to have those of you with us who are in the room and also those of you who are joining us online. And I hope you all enjoy today and excited as I am to hear all the different speakers, panelists, chairs speak. We've got a great programme and I want to say thank you in advance to all the speakers, everyone who's got together behind the scenes, and also to the audience, because I know you're going to ask us lots of exciting questions and I look forward to hearing them on you. There's no pressure there, just that's the expectation at the beginning of the day. The IRDR has grown a lot since last year. For those of you who were here last year at the annual conference, we've had many new staff, new students. So I'd like to welcome in particular those staff who have joined us in the last 12 months. Associate Professor in International Relations, Philip Cunliffe, Professor of Risk and Disaster Reduction, Mark Pelling, Professor in Geophysical Hazard Risks, Fatima Jalea, the Lecturer in Disaster and Crisis Risk Finance, Stefan, two Associate Lecturer teaching in Risk, Disaster and Humanitarianism, Miles Harris and Caroline Russell, Future Leadership Fellow in Climate and Change Adaptation, Susanna Fisher, and we're also soon to be joined by two lecturers on the 3rd of July, the Lecturer in Risk and Perception and Communication, Sarah Dryhurst, and the Lecturer in Disaster and Crisis Response, Dan Haynes, who you will be hearing from later today. We've also had an increase in student numbers. We're running our BSc Global Humanitarian Studies second year for the first time this last year, and next year will be the first time we have our third year students. So next year's conference, we'll be saying we're graduating our first set of BSc students, which is particularly exciting. We have about 90 students across our master's programs, the MRes in Risk and Disaster Reduction, the MSc in Risk, Disaster and Resilience, and the MSc in Risk and Disaster Science. And we've got some exciting changes coming to those programs related to some of those new appointments. Our BSc in Global Humanitarian Studies, as I've mentioned, has grown and is developing through the years, and we're excited to see those students with us and to be the future leaders of tomorrow. Some of you know IRDR well, and you know what we're about. Some of you, this might be your first experience here with us or joining us for a conference. We're all about multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary working across sectors, working across boundaries, working across borders. And so I hope many of the conversations we have today reflect that very ethos of what we're about and what we aim to do. We want to look at understanding the causes and consequences of disaster and really think about how can we catalyze change? How can we make a difference? Yesterday at the Humanitarian Summit, the common themes came through. The need for data, the need for evidence, for the importance of analyzing the evidence, using it, and then bringing in innovation and making change. And there was a call from many of the speakers to say we need to change the sector, we need to look at things differently, we need to accept sometimes that we might not be doing things in the best way, and we need to have new voices from different fields coming in with ideas. So that is an appeal to all of you to say be some of those new voices or the existing voices, but think in a new way. And particularly to our students, you will be those voices of the future. So use what you're learning and look at these challenges. Think about some of the questions posed today. Think about the challenges that are coming out from today and think, one day I'm going to solve them. And I always say this to our students. I say, this is what we want from you. I want to see in the future that you have solved one of these problems, or all of them, perhaps. Your names are going to be there. You are going to make a difference. And there is a desire for you. So really, keep that with you as you go through. So with that, I'd like to say again, welcome. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Rosanna Himmes, who's going to introduce the conference today and go through the themes and what's coming up today, and then we'll hand over to the speakers. So be involved, listen, challenge, innovate, be part of the conversation, but don't let it end today. Listen to what we're hearing today, absorb the themes, think about the challenges, but then do something about it. We don't want to have the same conversation in 5 years' time. In 5 years' time, we want to say, oh, I remember those conversations from 5 years ago, and this is what's happened since. This is how things have changed. This is how we're doing better. And now we've got a load of new problems to solve. So with that, I hand over to Rosanna Himmes. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. So a very warm welcome to the IRDR Annual Conference on Risk Without Borders, for everyone who's here in person and for all those attending online. My name is Rosanna Himmes, and I'm an associate professor in economics at UCL IRDR, and I'll be chairing this session with Stefan as the keynote. The pandemic was a really good reminder of how disaster risk knows no borders in a physical and metaphorical sense. And now risk spills over almost effortlessly across space and time, and working across these borders to reduce risk is a challenge for researchers and practitioners. So in today's conference, we will examine some of the challenges and possible solutions that risk researchers and practitioners face when assessing, managing, and reducing risk across different borders from multiple perspectives. So these include economic and political, formal and informal borders, borders considering data, communication, collaboration, and diplomacy. And we've got a lineup of prominent, extraordinary experts who have contributed immensely to their fields. Before we begin, though, there are some housekeeping announcements. So in case the fire alarm goes off, please note that the fire exits over there, and the fire will outside. With Wi-Fi access, you can log into the UCL guests in the available networks and then register your own details. It's a very warm day. Water fountains are on the ground floor by the machines, and the toilets are on the ground floor. Coffee and tea will be available during the morning and afternoon breaks and the evening reception. Lunch will be provided to speakers and staff and students, but in Mallet Room 1.2. And you can follow me, but we don't have fortunately for the other attendees. But of course, the good news is there are several wonderful cafes inside the building, and one of our event assistants at the front desk will be very happy to provide guidance if any of you are new to UCL or new to London. Now, with that, I would like to introduce to you Professor Stefan Dercon, who will be presenting the keynote address. Stefan is Professor of Economic Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and the Economics Department at the University of Oxford. He's also the Director of the Centre for the Study of African Economies that runs this wonderful conference. How many years is it now, Stefan? 15,
we
20?
lost count, about 31 it seems.
It is the most amazing conference. There you have, I would recommend you to join if you haven't, but yes, he's the director of the Center for the Study of Economies. Between 2011 and 2017, for nearly 8 years, Stefan was chief economist of the Department of International Development. That's the DFID, and that's a government department in charge of UK's aid policy and spending. And between 2020 and 2022, he was a development policy advisor to successive foreign secretaries at the FCDO. Stefan comes with a very strong academic and policy practice background as well, policy influencing background as well. So he'll be speaking on agency, anticipation, and disaster risk reduction for about 45 minutes in his keynote address, and then this will be followed by a question and answer session. Here's your chance to ask Stefan all those difficult questions. All those things that all those problems that you want to solve in 5 years, now's the time to start asking him about it. Stefan, we're really privileged and honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Rosanna. And it's great to be here. I'll be honest, I didn't quite know much about the setup here, and it's just exciting to see so many people interested in many of these issues. So So I'm going to talk about a bit on the policy side and a bit on the research side around things that have really annoyed me when I was working in DFID, which is actually something where I come very much out of the development side of international aid kind of context. As a researcher on development, I actually did my PhD long time ago about how poor farmers cope with risk in rural Tanzania and how they basically try to get rich by accumulating cattle and things like that. And but it was all focused on risk and this quest for getting more evidence around how do we think about both risk and then over time, how do we respond to it? You know, how can we do as policymakers in the policy set, you know, how do you respond to it? So once I joined DFID, as chief economist, you of course discovered that quite a lot of the aid money goes into disaster kind of relief and programs. And then you discover that actually we're broadly talking about, and I know I'm going to upset a few of you, an evidence-free zone. Relative to what's actually being constructed as an evidence base around development and arguably often the failures and difficulty to do it, there is just so little rigorous, careful evidence around anything to do with the humanitarian sector. And it's very striking. They all talk about data and evidence it was meant to do. They've been doing that forever. And it's a very hard sector to actually get ready to say, look, just trying to do good is not good enough. You need to think about how you do it. And not just assume because you have humanitarian principles and good principles in terms of what you want to do, that you actually do the right thing. And so this is something where I've, coming out of DFID, actually very much really felt like this is an area where also as research, I should try to get more involved in. I have a series of pieces of work over time. I wrote a book with a former student of mine, Daniel Clark, who is now the director of the Center for Disaster Risk Disaster Center for again reduction of something. Yeah, sorry, CDP. The protection. Sorry, I should know since I'm on the board of it. But it's early days. It's early in the morning. Anyway, CDP. That's what I knew. I was looking for my P. But you know, centered there that actually focuses. But you know, I'm an economist, I'm a social scientist, and I'm trying to think, he's very much comes out of the actuarial world, of the finance side. There's a lot there that, you know, the whole humanitarian sector often is just obsessed with just giving the money and trust us, we do well with it. And actually, no, we need to think about the systems, the structures, the way we do it, okay? So, and it's in a way that I want to talk about. I won't talk about my last job in government because, you know, as Rosanna also noticed, my CV, I don't put the names of these foreign secretaries I was advising, but, you know, because one can't be quite proud of the success one has with advising Dominic Raab and this trust. But anyway, but you still sit there in it. What I definitely learned in it, it's a highly political environment, and where evidence is actually this real struggle of trying to get, you know, serious evidence to take a place within it. So, and it's some of the things I want to talk about, and more specifically see doing it. Look, let me start with a basic fact, okay? So for all the research, what we do know that, of course, shocks, extreme events, climate disasters and other extreme events, they have long-lasting effects, okay? So, and it's the basic thing. That part of research, is huge amounts of evidence about it, okay? And the logic is that, you know, it's not just a temporary bleep, but it destroys people's assets, resilience, ability to actually recover. These things matter, okay? Clearly something has gone wrong already with my titles. Let me not worry about it. I have twice the same title, but don't worry. Clearly something went this morning wrong with my changing of the titles. But I want to actually first talk a bit about the existing system, the way the existing system tends to work, and then actually want to mainly focus on today on, you know, how can we begin to both use evidence, also political commitment that it needs to be part of it, to actually get something better. So the typical setup in a crisis, an extreme event happens. An earthquake, a flood, a drought, it happens. Somehow a serious crisis gets people are alerted to it. Could be with early warning, could be with other systems, but typically at some point it's in your face, okay? The moment at some point it comes in the press. The way the system tends to work is then, and we'll go in, the UN goes in, assessing needs assessments, doing the whole thing. We're going to do a nice planning process, all the UN agencies and so on, a humanitarian plan gets designed. Then we need to actually probably do an appeal, mobilize the funding, try to get the funding, and now we're going to actually give support to people. Okay, that's the kind of classic model. So, when I was in DFID, I was very involved in a number of these crises. 2015 in Ethiopia, it's a very striking one, it was an El Nino drought. Basically, around to the 1st of September, I'm a researcher on Ethiopia as well, I follow all this information, it's very clear the harvest was going to fail. In quite a lot of places, not just in the pastoralist areas in the east where it's often happening, much more recurrent, but actually in the highlands as well, the central and southern highlands. So you kind of know it, and we know it. Okay. The sequence that then happens is exactly what I described then. First of all, people takes until the end of the whole series, wait a little bit, but by early October, UN says we're going to mobilize ourselves. Of course, much more deeper into it, they assumed Ethiopia at the time was a country like Somalia, bring in all the experts from South Sudan and Somalia and behave as if that country, which actually was functioning remarkably well then, but let's start doing it, start mobilizing, getting your plan together by the early December. The appeal was ready, appeal was announced, early January, the money comes in, of course, only 53%, that's a normal thing with humanitarian plans, and then we start doing the whole thing. Strangely enough, by the time anything started being delivered, we were talking March, April, while actually we knew it in September. And the whole sequence is both a lot of time gets wasted, actually a lot of other things go really wrong, which is essentially we are highly politicizing it because, there was a big battle between the government, who actually has a safety net systems in place. The UN saying, no, but there's American money involved, so we can't go through the government. We have to set up a whole parallel system, and we're going to deliver it all in parallel, and you get endless stuff going on in the whole thing. Nepal, the earthquake, similar issues started happening, I remember being there in 2014, everybody says the big one is due at some point. Of course, we don't know when exactly, but the big one was going to come. You could walk in every government office and you see the multiple disaster response plans that every agency has funded. It's all beautifully on the shelf. It's already there. What happens? The earthquake happens. President is in Indonesia at that time. But basically the team gets together and says, oh, which one of the shelf? And they took one of the shelf and they started acting to it, probably as they should have done. They started trying to organize themselves a little bit. President flies back in after a few days and says, no, I'll take charge. Whip up all the plans, I'm going to take charge. And we're going to take charge in the whole response plan. And then, money begins to slowly flow in. And so we're talking, I think it was in May 2015, and by December 2015, at last, the cabinet manages to agree how they're going to spend the money. So 6 months later, and that kind of thing. So you get these things that are functioning, and my argument definitely has been for a while now, is that there's a lot to do with how we set up these systems. Where we wait for the disaster, then everything, we're going to start acting on it, we're going to set up the systems, we let actually political control to come in, whether it's from the international agencies or locally or whatever. And so what we get is that post-disaster, very slow, politicized tactical decision-making, in this case like in Nepal, a response that every agency needs to do their own thing. As I said, if it's American money, it can't go through the government, so it's going to be parallel systems, NGOs, and whatever need to be all in fighting over it. And in the end, when we then raise money with these appeal, we get typically about half the money we need to have. Think about incentives. Incentives matter in this story. If I'm the UN, how do I make my humanitarian response plan if I know that on average 53% will be funded? You know what you will do. You'll inflate it, but you can't prioritize. You actually make all kinds of a massive plan, and then actually it gets a very uncoordinated, very poor response. And the other side to it is that, of course, pre-disaster, you don't really plan, because actually, why should you plan if you just don't know what the resources and who will be in charge afterwards? Why would you plan anything beforehand? How would you decide which one of the disaster plans on the shelf that you're going to pick if you don't know what the president will say and how they will want to take charge of the whole thing? And as a result, you underinvest in all these things, because what's the point? Any outside agency comes in for disaster planning, you take the money because, keeps your system going. But actually, it is not real. And a big part of it is then essentially the financial side. You're just not going to invest in the things that you need to invest in. You may actually not invest in risk reduction either, but actually you just don't get it right. And then the whole financing model is very 12th century. 12th century is because it was before we discovered risk-based financing systems. Basically, you just do begging bowls. That's 12th century. You wait until the disaster happens, and then you go around and ask for the money. And I just want to emphasize, some of you may well be experts also on the finance side, but many are not, how important the finance is to create incentives to do the right thing. If you know it's afterwards, I have to go around. Why would I plan carefully? Because I have no idea how much money I get. If you go and look at humanitarian response plans of UN, there's a huge variance. Sometimes you get 40%, sometimes, if it's somehow a country in the news, you get 70%. And what are the incentives to prepare the plans if you know it's always underfunded? How do you design effective, efficient systems of response if you actually finance them in the end with a begging bowl? You have delays, you have all this kind of stuff. So one of the things that you get exposed systems, always responding afterwards based on these appeals that are done late, politicized, insufficient, and so on. And then the thing that I really value here is actually this simple point. Well, where are the people here? They are facing the disaster. They have no idea whether aid will come, because it's all going to depend on how much support is going to come in. It doesn't need to come from outside, even from their governments, because these processes are translated in local governments as well. In the US, it's between local governments and the federal disaster response planning. In India, it's also between the center and the state. You don't know what it will be. Well, the people there, they have to just wait. They have no idea what the right response is. They have no certainty that actually support will come. They have no agency. They can't plan anything. Because disasters are part of life, but the one big unknown is it's what the nature of the support. So you need to do with your own resources. Yes, they do, and we have a lot of evidence that poor people prepare themselves for extreme events. But when it comes close to it, well, they have no agency in actually dealing with anything, because everything comes exposed. When it's late, well, how can I actually then really act still? And it all becomes this kind of passive recipient of our support, while there's no more agency around people. So, and this is a bit where we're kind of thinking about, how can we get systems going that actually have agency and that actually anticipate what's happening? So I'm going to talk about an example of some work we've been doing, also with that World Food Programme, but also with OCHA in New York, the basically humanitarian coordinator's office, at least the previous one was very interested in that, and basically systems that we're trying to set up. And actually, I think what most suggest this is an example, not the only one, but of the way we should think more systematically about these responses. And so the question is really, how do you design a better humanitarian system that are reliable, better targeted, that are faster, and that actually respect people? And how can we actually do this, that we do it? So in a book with Daniel Clark that I mentioned earlier, we talked about the basic framework. Actually, the big part of it, can we actually deliver these things, was not clear then. And so we now have a set of examples working with international agencies where we can actually show this kind of approach begins to work, and actually is quite a lot of interest now in beginning to scale some of these things. And what are the three things? If at the moment the decision-making process is exposed and highly politicized, and very much like, oh well, the big man has to, or the big woman has to be in charge, usually it's a big man, has to be in charge and making all the big decisions, can we actually get a much better decision-making framework that actually is so much more evidence-based. Similarly, rather than expose starting to get all the experts from Somalia and Sudan into Ethiopia and say, oh, we'll just start setting up all these parallel systems and we ignore what's there, actually say, can we actually get pre-established, clearly action plans that we would implement? But then the key part of it, and I will talk less about it, but hopefully in questions it can come up as well, it's about the financing. That's the glue that keeps these things together. If the financing for particular plans is there, pre-arranged, can do it, okay? And that's the illusion that I will make. It's a bit like insurance. If you have an insurance policy, you contract with someone that you will get a certain type of support. By the way, I'm not trying to suggest we buy insurance for these places, but you think like an insurance system. There's lots of reasons why. It wouldn't just be market-based stuff, but basically let those who need to respond, whether it's a government or an international agency, and hopefully together, they think about it. We need to pre-arrange the financing as a way of enforcing the contract we have with the citizens. We have a particular way that we will respond, a fair way of responding, but the finance will guarantee that you can actually implement it, that it's not weak. And that's why the finance can't be exposed with the begging bowls. It has to pre-arranged as well. So, what are the ingredients that we could use in the cases that we're working on? So first of all, it's a massive body of evidence that actually tells us that, keep it simple. Cash transfers are not perfect, but they are amazing, relative to virtually anything else you ever compare it with. So basically, we have a massive body of evidence, whether it's in crisis settings or in more social protection, more regular crisis type of things, seasonal hunger and things like that, that actually keep it simple, actually is probably the best guarantee that people actually get it, okay? If we start tracking in food, we end up complicating things because we're going to have to deal with traders, with imports, with distortions, with price effects and the whole thing. If we give the transfer in cash to people that they can buy the food, it seems to be typically much better. I simplify it, but I will actually say, and that's a strong statement to make, there is no area in development where there's more evidence than on that cash transfers really make a difference in terms of welfare of people. There's probably no area at all when we look at beneficiary impacts that actually it does make a substantial impact. It's not perfect, but it's quite stuff. I can talk more about it later. For me, it was brought home once where we were doing an evaluation of a social protection system, of a cash transfer system in Western Kenya, and we were walking around in the village to talk to some of the beneficiaries preparing for our evaluation. And there was this one lady and said, oh, it's nice to see you here. Can I tell you what the most beautiful sound in the world is? And she said, ping, ping, ping. I said, well, what is this? Oh, it's the sound like the raindrops falling on my tin roof. Ping, ping, ping. And we looked all very confused. That's the noise that my mobile phone makes when the cash transfer arrives. And so, it's something there, and this, we have to be careful with this beneficiary feedback type of things, but it's there. We also know in humanitarian setting, even in refugee camps and so on, how even we may not be able to prove that cash is so much better than more in-kind support, but it's definitely more dignified than many other things. And the restoring of dignity, definitely in extremely set circumstances, is clearly very important. I'll come back to that on some of the evidence. The second ingredient we can do better is that once we accept that if we keep it simple, we may actually help better, is actually the second thing is the change of the extent of digital access even in poor settings. Basically, mobile payment systems that in many developing countries are arguably better developed than they were here. Now it's going much faster after COVID, but actually, we were doing this in Kenya for a while. We have these amazing schemes now in India that very fast, within a few years, totally digitize up to the poorest groups of population the systems. It's digital payment system. We're working in Bangladesh on the things I'll talk about more, where I was surprised by the numbers because I was concerned with our evaluation. I was just concerned that actually the bank data suggests that 80% of households now have digital wallets. Okay? Now that's 80% of households, even though we know they don't always have a mobile phone, but they just have the SIM card, a digital wallet in it, they can use it with someone else, and they can receive it. Mobile payments, of course, simplify, even in crisis settings, the way we can actually reach people fast, timely, with clear beneficiary feedback systems possible and so on. So it helps with accountability and corruption as well. And then the last thing, you're pleased to hear, science. Science helps. You know, it's, despite the fact that sometimes economists and social scientists may behave it isn't, but it helps. And actually, one of the things, of course, the big changes is that whether it's based on climate models or hydrological models or seismological models, if that's the right word, we can actually model much more. Okay, and this is what we can exploit, because if we can model with predictive power, we can go faster. And so it's basically what we'll exploit is the ability to use forecast models in a more effective way to actually go faster. So that you don't wait until everything has happened, but you can be earlier. And so basically, I'll give you one version, an anticipatory humanitarian system that can be looked at, has these principles where you do a lot of careful work on the forecasting and the decision-making process, where you have clear action plans, and where you use the pre-arranged financing, I typically would say, to tie the hands of the politicians and the UN, both of them, and you basically tie their hands to something you're actually going to do. If you use that, I will show that we can actually do this, we can actually be earlier, and as a result, provide more agency to people as well in the choices they can make. So, and it's all these things need to be built in. So what we're talking about is a set of research programs. This is a slide of where OCHA, so the humanitarian coordinator in New York, has been supporting it. So this was Mark Lowcock, the former chief economist, as a former permanent secretary of DFID, that was there, was very interested in that stuff. He managed to mobilize people to do it. One of my nice stories that I heard at some point is that this book I had written about disaster risk finance, when he joined OCHA on the first day, he did exactly how a manager can scare his whole organization to read the book. He waved the book around and said, maybe you should all read this. And so the result is endless pilots in the system of trying to do it. Where we're actually trying to, only few of them I'm involved in, but mainly lots of other people, try to see, can we actually get this going? Can we use these principles to just be faster, and as a result, getting before the crisis is at its extreme level, and can we actually do this? So what did we do in Bangladesh? Let's make it concrete. So face value would say, okay, what we did is not that different. We managed to get, with WFP, managed to get $50, about $50, sent by mobile phone towards people's digital wallet, about $50 to a number of households, 23,000 households, when the Yamuna River in Bangladesh flooded. Now, the main thing that we managed to do is that rather than the usual thing where the aid tends to come a couple of months later after the plan has been approved and the whole thing is it, we were there 5 days before the flood. So we managed to target people, and I'll show you how well the forecast algorithms worked, basically that we could actually get that money to them before the crisis. We think we got it 50 to 75 days before normally the response would have been reaching these people. Okay? So that's the kind of thing that we could achieve in it. That was a massive flood in 2020, second highest Yamuna River flooding. And of course, this is where the science can help us, because you can know quite a lot in advance what will happen with flooding if you do the hydrological modeling well. Basically, Yamuna River, I remember hiking in the Himalayas to its source. That's a long way up in the Himalayas. And it's a long way before you reach Bangladesh. And so during the monsoon period, you can follow how it's evolving, and actually very careful hydrological models were used all the way from inside India then to actually get this work going. And in fact, what we managed to do then is by basically having a trigger-based system. And a more effective system is basically trigger-based and forecast-based. So we managed to do the forecast model. We built in beforehand 5 to 10 day projections, and we built in triggers that they needed to be triggered at what we think would happen 5 days later, 10 days later. Okay, and so you can see it. And basically the system worked. First, the 10-day trigger with more forecast error would be triggered. Preparation starts. The 5-day trigger, we decided to act. Okay, and so we basically do it. It's essentially like that. We could, of course, only do this sensibly. It's not just a bunch of scientists somewhere in an office and saying, oh, it's going to happen, and then make some noise. But actually, we had pre-arranged an identification of vulnerable people based on previous experience of vulnerability, and we managed to identify them. In the period after it got triggered, we could call all of them, check whether they were still who they were, and so on and so on. We could do this whole thing, and then actually manage to get the cash transferred to their digital wallets, all within a matter of days. And we had then arranged the finance. Basically, we were guaranteed that however much we would need, we would get the money literally with the press of the button. Immediately the money would be available. In this case, it was from a fund in the UN that we had it. So here is a little bit how the science was working. So let me try to explain. So this is 2020, what was happening. We have here the observed water flow is blue, but the dotted line is the prediction model. It was pretty good, no? And it was the prediction, and this was the 5-day prediction. So, you know, we were pretty well exposed, also pretty happy to see this, that actually we really got the models really right. I mean, I didn't do the models, but the modelers did an amazing job on that. But it's important that, you know, if we did it just the 5 days, that's when we needed to make sure the money could start going into people's pockets. So we triggered everything to be ready, and we just simply corrected who should be getting it 5 days before. Just a basic quick algorithm correction doing it. But all the preparations was triggered 10 days before. And so in this 10-day period, a call center called everybody, checked their details, whether it's all there, whether the digital wallets were in place, and the whole kind of thing. And so then we could 5 days before starting to operationalize it, and you see then 2 days later everything started going into people's wallets, and a few with some corrections, most of it. So this is the distribution, the histogram of the cash transfers, the recipients, and so on. A few came a bit later because there were still some errors and we wanted to correct errors. Creates a bit of issues with the evaluation, I will be honest. But relative to all the things, you know, the bunch was there. And then basically the humanitarian plan was announced well after we had already done all the transfers. And then you see, that's the plan announced. Then they go to fundraise, then they're going to get the trucks in, then they go to start the stuff, and then they start actually moving it. Because that's how it is, you know. Cash transfers, even typically in the humanitarian system, is literally a truck with cash going to the village and start distributing it. So don't have any illusions how these things actually are working. So we could really get a fascinating type of thing. So this is just an illustration what the science can do. Now, the rest of the talk, I want to actually talk a little bit about, and so what happened? And so this is probably one of the first evaluations of a humanitarian response. I say that because actually it's incredibly hard to ever get a humanitarian agency to help you find the decent counterfactual so that you can actually get some evidence of the impact. We have endless evidence of, yeah, the people are really happy that I gave them $50. And that's basically the nature of most of the evidence of humanitarian evaluation. You only talk to the beneficiaries, but you don't talk to those who didn't get it. It's a counterfactual. And this is what we managed to do. I will go quick a bit. The cash transfer evidence doesn't tell us that. The cash transfer evidence mostly, there's a bit of exceptions, but mostly tells us in more secure settings, social security systems, cash transfer systems, where we have to be able to randomize and we have been able to do things, we could actually get some careful things. This is not something you can do in a crisis situation. You know, randomizing in a crisis situation lots of good reasons why you would probably not touch it. You could probably do it. There's limited resources, but it's not a very comfortable thing to do. Okay? We also couldn't really, we also felt like we shouldn't try to do this here. But where the evidence are, well, we have very little evidence of what happens when you have a fast onset disaster, a climate thing, earthquake, transfers, and so on. We also have very little evidence whether the timing actually matters. Okay? Whether the timing actually matters, because you could say, look, maybe it didn't matter that it came 50 days later. They would run down their savings and then you could bring the money in. It's all fine. Maybe it works. In general, the impact of air interventions, very, very little. And so this is what we now try to do, is to actually say, well, how did this one-off cash transfer matter? Well, I'm very glad to say, I probably wouldn't stand here telling you all these things excitedly, that we do find that actually 3 months later, when we could do, this was middle of COVID, so we had to do a phone survey, very careful phone survey, people have perfected this, how to do this. We could actually, and the fact that we work digitally, of course, helped here, we could actually establish that anticipatory cash transfers, 3 months later, still got us better welfare outcomes. Surprisingly broad effects, even though the transfer is only $50. We clearly have evidence that the agency of the recipients, the choice set of the recipients was increased. And the gains, and I will talk you through these results now, but I just want to signpost them. And the gains from the early action are actually quite significant. And even 5 months later, we still have better outcomes for those people than the people who didn't receive it, even though it's only $50. Okay? So how did we do this? How did we do this? And this is I need to briefly talk about the nature of the counterfactual. So as I told you, World Food Programme had made pre-arranged lists of people, of who they were going to, had classified as vulnerable for these kind of events across, I think it's 171 unions, so very widely spread, those who actually probably should be eligible to do it. Now, one of the things was that because we had to work fast, in fact, we designed this project 5 weeks before it actually triggered. So we had very, very little time. I think actually I like this. You know, research that really needs to go in the field very quickly and all hands on deck and really focusing on it. But actually the one thing we didn't succeed in doing, or they didn't succeed in doing, and actually helped us in the end, there are multiple digital wallet providers in the country. There's no difference in the cost. You have the BRAC one, Bcash, but you have some other, the post office one, you have other ones as well. So multiple digital wallets. There's close to zero cost to starting it, literally one little phone call that you don't have to pay for. So a little bit of time to actually set it up. Lots of people have multiple wallets because a lot of government support programs in the past were delivered through these digital wallets, but not always through the same one. So you've got lots of different ones. One thing that happens if you haven't used it for 6 months, it goes stale. And you have to do a new phone call to unlock it. And if you don't wait too long, somehow it seems to be then getting harder. Basically, we seem to have that 96% of people that the WFP called had digital wallets, but only about half of them actually had the wallet with a company we managed to do a contract in time with to actually do it, Bcash, the BRAC company. And so basically we exploited the fact that virtually everybody had digital wallets, but they may not have had a particular one activated. And so the counterfactual is those people with digital wallets, but actually we couldn't really reach in time, that should have been eligible, but couldn't reach in time. And so subsequently, because this contact with them was reestablished through a phone call, we know that we could call them, so we could call virtually everybody from both of these lists, and they provide our counterfactual. Some got the money into their account in their digital wallets, and others didn't do it. And so that's our counterfactual of our design. So those who didn't have the right or incorrect ones, and Bcash again, so this is a digital wallet of BRAC. Okay, and now we could do, after 3 rounds, we checked with them, a phone survey, fairly simplified, And then after 5 months, we could check one more time. And then we could use also the satellite actual data on the floods to actually check later on, the severity of the flooding and the timing of the flooding, did it actually matter in the kind of the way it was responded. So to tell you a couple of these responses, it's always relative to that counterfactual. Some of you may have spotted then, I do not have a counterfactual for a classic aid program that comes 50 days later. Okay? So the counterfactual is those who didn't get the support to those who got the support. So there's other pieces of research we do where we will have that counterfactual, where more the classic approach is actually used. Okay? So this is relative to those people who were vulnerable, that should have received the transfers, but they couldn't because mechanically it wasn't possible. So you basically say, well, you got, we know what people did with it. They stocked up on food and water. They spent it on health and services and so on. And then, like the simplest indicator and the clearest, days going without food during the crisis. In the treatment ones, there was about 15% that couldn't get it, but actually the counterfactual was 30%. So we managed by half the probability that they would go without food at all during the crisis. We have done a whole series of other indicators. So 3 months later, we find that child consumption is still better. 3 months later, $50, and then 3 months later, relative to those who didn't get that, they're better. There's still definitely a higher score on life satisfaction. Anyone who ever uses this is on a 10-point scale, the ladder of life. Where do you put yourself on that ladder from 0 to 10 in terms of overall how you value your life? I just want to show you the control mean, 2. You will virtually never in the world see that as low as that, okay? These are desperately poor people. We managed to push it up. It's still tough life, okay? But drought does cause still troubles. We can do much better. Here we would score on average about 7, okay? Most developing countries would be about 5 or 5.5. This is where we are in a crisis situation. The way they don't judge their life on the best life possible, 10, the worst life, 0, they're actually pretty low. But we can at least improve it. Now, what we find really striking is that, and I should actually, if you worry about reading it, I should have said that. So this is a picture here. This is all measured relative in standard deviations improvement. Control would be at a 0. This tells us how much better they are, and then it gives us the standard error, the confidence interval there. And so we find they do more, they're more likely, almost half a standard deviation more likely to do preemptive actions. They act. I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment. They're less likely to lose assets, less likely to livestock, other assets, crop losses. They manage to do all kinds of preemptive stuff. They seem to be less likely to borrow. It's a little bit more ambiguous. It's not significant either, and I could talk more about it. They later on declare themselves they have a better earning potential, an index about the opportunities they see there for themselves. They're basically able to replant, more likely to replant, thanks to this thanks to the particular intervention we did. And then, give an idea of the agency that they have. They're more likely to evacuate their households. They manage to more likely to evacuate their livestock, more likely to have purchased food in advance, less likely to have lost small livestock, less likely to have lost poultry, less likely to have to borrow money to do it, and they're more likely to be able to work for wages to actually compensate for their earning losses. So it's actually pretty kind of a strong set of impacts that we can see. What is also interesting, and it would take us a bit too long and I won't take the time for that, is that actually the speed of delivering the cash, we can do it, because you could see there was a histogram it was a few days difference in terms of how quickly the money came. Moreover, as you can imagine with a hydrological map, not everywhere is the flood peak at the same moment. So we can actually calculate how much before the flood peak, on average is 5 days, but how much in advance did we manage to get there? And does it matter whether it was 4 days or 7 days in advance? We can actually find that actually by being in advance, every day improves 3 and 5 months later their consumption outcomes. Every day you were earlier near the peak. We can't simply say, should it be 20 days or 30 days? Of course, the range is limited. You can't say, should it be 5 months before, whatever. Where we can actually show that the timing actually mattered. You can see here actually this line is the flood peak, the most likely when the flood peak is at its highest, and you see that the mass of the cash transfers happened before that peak. Okay, let me come to conclude and actually bring it back to where I had started. So we have an example here of actually where we combine new things, knowledge and evidence around that cash actually is a sensible thing to do, knowledge about that digital payments, really should try to get into that world and getting the systems going because you can go faster. Also about the science and the predictive power of it, that actually we can use that to actually improve welfare during the flood and 3 months later, okay? Basically, failing to act quickly has a real cost. We seem to have evidence on that. Also that it offers agency. You do actually a bit better, that you actually allow them to be a bit more in control of the decisions they take, Of course, they're not totally in control, there's no illusion there, but they can do some of these things. And we also find evidence that the speed of delivery, speed matters, okay? And all this kind of political bickering typically exposed, and when should we do it, how should we do it? It really has a cost, and we should just be very careful about it. And so this is what we managed to do in Bangladesh then, an impact, basically combination of an early warning, but early action system. I don't like early warning systems, I like early action systems. And this is a form of an early action system, something where the cash is beforehand offered thanks to the early warning system. It's data driven that we can do it. So we're trying some of these things out. We're doing a big evaluation in Niger in a very different setting. This is for seasonal hunger, which is a slow onset disaster. Again, a bit like the Ethiopia case, we know roughly in September what the crisis will be. Most of the time, the cash transfers or any support or food aid tends to be given by about August the next year, during the depth of the crisis. And the whole thing is set up like that. And so, well, why don't we do something slightly differently? We know that actually this is when we know where the rains have failed, because it's in June to September. They harvest then, and we have lots of great data. Why don't we actually try to think, should it not be better and give people more choices to using actually the forecast of how severe the crisis will be on the ground to actually start doing early transfers. So we're doing this now with a system where, and it's everywhere in the Sahel, it's that latter thing. They only do it during the rainy season in the end. Yes, then the situation is most desperate. What would happen if we spread out a transfer? We start actually in January and we continuously do a small transfer. Or alternatively, what is it if we give the same transfer that we would give through the rainy season, but we do it in March or April, so that they have time to prepare their response. So in the midst of it, looks very interesting what's coming out, but I've been told by my colleagues who can't tell them. But anyway, looks interesting. The end line is still going on, so we're not complete in everything. But basically, it gives us a sense where you can go away from this kind of crisis, and then we'll get into action, to actually something saying, well, get a system going beforehand with a clear action plan, how you're going to deal with it, and have the finance in place. And that's then the example we've given here. And, and I want to just end with a brief comment on, one of the great attractions to this is that we know from a lot of the evidence that politicians don't like this. I've worked with them, they don't like these things. Our politicians in the UK or a local politician in India or whatever, they love a drought. In fact, there's a famous book written in India, Everyone Loves a Good Drought, and it's basically about the system loves a drought. I worry at times even the humanitarian system loves a crisis because that's the adrenaline going, the adrenaline junkies can go. But definitely politicians like it because that's the moment to show leadership, plant their flag, and so on. Crisis is when they can make their name. We know from a lot of evidence that actually it's really hard to convince politicians to spend before a crisis. In fact, we know a lot of evidence that from the US, from Mexico, from India, that actually voters don't reward you for preparedness. If you do preparedness planning, they don't reward you because, of course, they don't see anything has happened. They don't see a crisis. The crisis is, as I called it in my book, dull, because there's no journalist that will talk about it because it's handled well. There's no journalist or politician that can make their name on it. So you get really this problem of how do we get them to do it? Now, because they get electoral advantage of responding well to a crisis, they get zero electoral advantage from responding beforehand. Very big problem with climate, by the way, in general, and adaptation investments. So this is a suggestion here, is that say, look, we'll still make it visible that you're doing things. Can we actually get them to agree to have systems here in place that, you know, for extreme events, that they still can act and that we can seem to be acting. And I think these are examples I think we can actually convince politicians to do, because they can still do their flag planting, but actually we do it properly evidence-based, science-based, forecast-based, with proper financing. I thank you then. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Oh, it means I can have a drink. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Any questions? Yes, so we do have a lot of questions, but I have the advantage of being the chair in sort of asking Stefan the sort of burning question that I had when I was listening to that totally amazing, inspiring presentation. You said that the main impact seems to, it's driven by the cash transfer. I was wondering whether you could actually unpick to what extent that effect was due to a credible early warning versus the money itself. Because could it be that it was actually that when people actually knew that something was coming, and I was serious, so serious that someone's giving you money, someone's calling you beforehand to make sure your wallet's set up and all that, is that what drove the agency? So the credibility, it's not just the early warning as well. We always have early warnings. I mean, Sri Lanka had early warnings. Everything placed for a drought that was impending, and nothing happened. Nobody moved. It's just, it failed miserably. So can you unpack that early warning effect? So how much of the agency was due to early warning? How much was actually due to the cash? And how much actually the credibility?
Very good. No, I'm smiling because Stefan is sitting there, and we, you know, if some particular funders had given us the money, we would know in about a year in Mozambique whether this actually would have happened working with Stefan Liffers, and we would have been able to do this. So it's still, any funders in the room, it's all ready to go. So yes, you want to impact that, and we've had lots of arguments around it, but you made actually the right point. It's not that the early warning wasn't given. And again, we don't have the clear evidence or that, you know, what is the information content and people had in this particular case. But just like in Sri Lanka, the flood warnings were being given, you know, and, you know, you have all the agencies getting ready, everybody is there, so the flood warnings is there. So we given the nature of the effects that we then see, and the fact that there is, you know, we think that in that sense, the liquidity constraints, the idea of having actually the cash and the resources at that moment, the extra cash available, is kind of doing it. But I will not try to claim that we have because that's not how the evaluation was set up in doing it. So we will be able to get better information like that also from our Sahel work. Where we made a point is that saying that people were told early on, and we found it actually fair that everybody was being told but we have a proper control group there as well that actually doesn't get that information. So basically what I said, everybody who got a different modality of cash is being told also there's something happening. So it means also the people who get the late money, they're already told in advance. And so we should be able to disentangle the credit constraint from the information constraint. And it's a little bit as well as that, I am generally very concerned that we over-invested in early warning relative to early action systems. And that's the kind of choice. There's so much more money has flown into all the data. And often you have the sense that in London, we know that a crisis is happening, but it's actually not quite clear that there is a system in place to actually mobilize people and help them to start coping with it.
And it's also about the credibility. So maybe the cash actually gave credibility as well to the fact that the warning was serious, because I do know in other country contexts, in American Sri Lanka, that sometimes the fire alarm goes. That again.
And so there's an interesting thing, because this is the cry wolf problem, the kind of, if you remember the Aesop fable, it's actually a real issue, I think, generally in the humanitarian system. Sitting in London, the cry wolf problem was there all the time, because almost every day the UN does an appeal. That is the worst crisis that ever has happened. How many times Ethiopia, the country I know well, Ethiopian risk of famine has been declared the worst ever in history, and then say, well, and I remember sometimes even sitting with government officials meaning well in the country and saying, why did they call it like that? This is extremely localized. This is a very different. So the cry wolf problem is there as well. Wouldn't be surprised that citizens start responding in the same way to it.
Okay, so I do have some other burning questions, but I'll hold my questions back. And let me maybe take about 3 questions the first time, and then Stefan can answer. Estella, you had a question? Oh, yes. Can you please introduce yourself, just your name and where you're from, before you ask it?
So I'm Stella Carpi, a lecturer in humanitarian studies here at IRDR. I mostly worked on displacement from Syria, and I really wish we had anticipatory cash at the beginning of the crisis, honestly, because there I can say that cash as a synonym with dignity came quite late for very particular reasons. Most Western and secular humanitarian actors actually believe that cash negatively affects political neutrality. I was just wondering what's your take on this, because of course it's an animated debate in humanitarian studies.
Okay, maybe I'll take another 2 questions. Yes. No, I think it won't be recorded if you don't use the mic.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Rasha. I'm a master's student risk disaster resilience at the Institute. And my question basically comes like, how can you implement anticipatory action in a dysfunctional state?
Okay, and we have Lisa as well.
My name is Lisa. I'm also from the IRDR. I guess the obvious question is, I really appreciate the talk and I thought it was great, but we're mostly talking about pilots and the obvious question of scale up. So my understanding from talking to the IFRC that each of the one hazard anticipatory action agreements has taken about 2 years to get to agree. And so if we're talking about one hazard and one agency, the obvious ambition, I assume, is to scale up to multi-agency, multi-hazard anticipatory action agreements. Also, given that this impacts coordination, because we know from very long-running programs like Cash for Work, if different agencies give different amounts of money at different time, it leads to a lot of problems. So just the simple question of scaling up.
Thank you. Stefan, I think you should.
Yes, no, that's great questions. And in some sense, they're a bit linked. So, look, I was just in can't remember when it was it last week? This week, I can't remember, in Berlin in a social protection conference, must have been last week. And there I was actually talking about the system part of it, you know, and it comes about how do we get these kind of systems set up so that we don't do pilots, that we are ready to do it. And I think, you know, even the way you asked the question shows how wrong the system is. And it's not about criticism of you, but just the way it seems to be operated. Let me be clear, is that one thing that by keeping it simple, and by consciously keeping it simple, we create the opportunity to actually possibly building up a system, okay? Digital cash transfers, you know, it's a technology that even in Syria was available in the crisis. Even at the beginning, it was actually available. In principle, it's there. I work a lot on digital side as well as a development person. There's nothing that you can get more easily, even the most crooked government, excited about than is digital stuff. They like shiny stuff. Even our ministers in London, they always like the shiny stuff. So this is actually a real important part of it, to actually saying, look, this is our entry point to actually begin to build up systems. Okay, we can argue about it is and what the models would be, and maybe afterwards I'm happy to talk to a few of them, but I really don't like the proprietary systems, including the M-Pesa system, because actually, in the end, it's one company. You want to actually get the interoperable systems going. But anyway, there's a lot of thinking going on. India has been fascinating in that respect in rolling out interoperable systems that other countries want to do it. Now, if you start with a system, you actually have the plumbing, so to speak, in place. So in any country where there's a window of opportunity, whether it's Somalia today or Ethiopia in general, this is what we should try to build, is the plumbing. And so we should stop doing, as we've done for the last 70 years, of the kind of humanitarian, the outside cavalry that comes in, and then every cavalry has different color horses, and then they all make an absolute mess of it, which is what basically happens. And we should get everybody there in New York to calm down and stop doing their stuff, and actually think carefully, can we start building up the systems? Because if we were very close in Syria that we could do it, we were very close, and there was lots of people looking at it, can we actually set it up? And then you get well-meaning, principled people making it too complicated, saying, ooh, this is really tricky politically and so on. It's easier than a lot of the other stuff we do, okay? It's so much easier politically than the other stuff we can do. And basically, I remember telling to Mark Lowcock one day, when he was a humanitarian coordinator and thing, one day you should be in a situation when a country like Syria go pear-shaped, that you literally, with the pressing of a button, actually the cash will just go. And no more white trucks driving around the country, and no more UN stuff doing things they shouldn't be doing, no more old military people doing logistics. You know, just do that, because you know that you can reach it, but you need to get the plumbing in place before. And we were very close there to actually being able to do it, and too late we actually took the opportunities to actually do it, you know, because it's so simple with the system. So you start there. I think it's easier to get a political commitment there and doing. Why do I emphasize this relative to my things? Because if I have the plumbing, I don't end up having to do all the negotiations that you do it. I actually have an interoperable system that, you know, WFP doesn't have to keep on fighting with UNICEF and all the others in the UN system. Actually, you all use the plumbing. If you find doing it, let's try to coordinate, but at least we don't have to coordinate all the time about the whole system and who's on the ground or whatever, because we have the plumbing set up. So that's what we need to do. The finance is a big part of it, because something needs to go through the plumbing, yeah? So what you do in a dysfunctional state, well, we don't know what we do in a dysfunctional state, but most dysfunctional states have moments of less dysfunctionality. You grab the windows of opportunity, and again, you try to build the systems. You know, there are far fewer countries dysfunctional now than they used to be. There's many countries that are today dysfunctional that weren't. You know, if Ethiopia stabilizes, we need to build up that system in Ethiopia, because we know that fundamentally civil war happens in countries where civil wars happens before. And so you basically need to get a functioning state there. And you know, you use windows opportunity to do it. So there's a lot of that stuff that you need to do it. So how do you deal in dysfunctional state? Yeah, I don't know, you hope for the best during the dysfunctionality, but every time there's a window of opportunity, you think about the plumbing. Okay, I could talk at length like South Sudan. We totally missed the opportunity since the original peace deal. During the period that we could to build up the system, nobody's building up the system today. Everybody's behaving as it's fine today, and we do all as if business as usual. No, we need to build up today the systems for the next day that Salva Kiir and Riek Machar fall out over rent sharing of oil profits, and we need to be ready for it because it's going to happen. And so that's what you do. So you don't, during the dysfunctionality, you can't do it, but you can build up the system before. And so then finish on that is that this is actually comes back to the pilot versus scale thing. You know, the pilot shows us proof of concept. At the moment, we need to now get the systems going because all the stuff we described, we can only do if we have the system going. If we do it from the spreadsheet of WFP, we can't put 3 million people on the spreadsheets. We could do that with 12,000 to 25,000 people. And at the moment, all the social registries are some spreadsheets, and then you have some other stuff there and so on. This is not a digital system. So you need to get it integrated and doing it. And that's what you need to do because I think that's the only way forward. Otherwise, we'll sit here and talk about exactly the same problems in 20 years.
Brilliant. Any further questions? Okay. So shall we start with, okay, yeah. Yes.
There we go. Thank you so much for a great talk, and it was really exciting to see the data, the impact evaluation, those effect sizes. My name's Sarah Dryhurst. I'm a soon here at the IRDR. So one question that I had was, it was for your pilot where you were showing the data, that forecast that you had from the flood, as we saw, was, you know, the uncertainty around it was very, very effective. It was almost a prediction. But what happens in situations where you have much more uncertainty around the forecast that you're using to trigger the financial investment? And perhaps when, because of the probabilistic nature, that event actually doesn't happen, yet the money has been transferred and released. Because at that stage, arguably, that's not then the best way to spend that money, but equally, you can't go to people and try and, I mean, can you go and take the money back? That's the difficulty. So yeah, that was.
Excellent, yeah.
I'm Philip Cunliffe, Associate Professor in International Relations here at the IRDR. And it was a wonderful talk, and it's heartening to hear, in this field, it's heartening to hear about programs that can be rolled out that look so tremendously successful. The one thing where I was less convinced, and in fact I would almost say, I think it would be guaranteed to fail, and something I would like to hear you talk more about, is when you talked about the assumption of tying politicians' hands. And that seems to me that it simply wouldn't work. That's been the model, I think, for the last 30 years in the international system more broadly. Has been efforts to tie politicians' hands in various ways through all sorts of institutions and agreements. And that model is breaking down now. We're in an era of greater geopolitical competition and rivalry, electoral volatility, populist insurgencies, not just in the West, but around the world at large. And in that context, it seems to me it would be very unwise to try and build on the idea of tying politicians' hands. The assumption being that politicians have no real legitimacy or function or representative function at all. And at times in your talk, it seemed like you would have, the idea would be just to kind of subtract the politicians and the politics, and you would have this perfectly kind of spontaneous system that would function smoothly and would be perfectly calibrated without any kind of interference. And so I suppose the challenge I'd like to put to you is, how would you scale this model? How would you work further with the kinds of assumptions and ideas that you've put there, but without trying to tie politicians' hands, but rather trying to build their incentives into it more?
Then there's one more question from
Hi, I'm Dan Haynes, also soon to be starting here as a lecturer. Is there still a place for public giving in a model that relies on anticipatory transfers? Would there be any DEC appeals to the public in this case?
Okay, that's these three. Great. Okay, so they're quite different here, the questions. So let me first briefly on the uncertainty that's in by its nature. And so in a sense, coming, when we talk about, anything that's parametric, that's predictive, that's based on algorithm prediction, we'll get some people that should have gotten the transfer that didn't get it, and people that got the transfer that shouldn't have got it. And so you make errors, like in an insurance setting or in risk, we talk about basis risk is there fundamentally there. Now, I mean, I should first of all say is that, we'll have that with any system, also with an exposed system. They make errors, and then everybody. And so, as a critique of trying to do this anticipatory, it's not the strongest one, because the basis of which humanitarian response plans are done is still with very little data and all kinds of issues there. But the point is it's like by doing this algorithm is that you can do some updating, Bayesian updating you can do, and in a way it's also something we did. Our initial trigger had a particular list. We started calling them, where we updated it 5 days later before the thing. So and so this is actually typically how I like to think about it, is that you try to think about, and surely for each intervention, and we may never be able to establish it, but there's probably an optimal moment to release the money before the crisis. You may well be able to calculate or structurally model it one day, but may well be different crises. But what you would typically set up is I always thought a bit like a rocket launcher, and where the countdown, at 100. So think of a rocket going into space. You start at 100 and then you got to go to 0. So you can abort mission. And so but the important thing that I definitely experienced inside the UK system, and in fact, I was there with the Ebola crisis stuff. If we had these triggers for early action, even if it's not about the cash going or the support going to people or the other support going to people, but if we had started counting at 100 or basically 6 months when we knew already there was Ebola there, and then slowly do it, you do certain actions. Okay, and then there's a moment, of course, you release the cash. And you will know then, maybe soon afterwards, you make errors. Not going to take anything away. There's no need to it. But you can, people that should have got it, you can still add something. And the way you would think about it is not to fully replace everything you do, but actually you just keep on updating. An example could be is that you could do an early release of half the money or something, and then you do it. So you can play around with it. And I think doing this as a data-driven thing, you have the information to try to update it. Something we didn't mention, there's a lot of research going on to do another part of it. It's on the targeting. So you have the one side, we relied on the WFP giving us the targeting list and then just assuming they're without errors. Of course, people's circumstances change, and even if you have a registry of people that to do it. So similarly, people are doing this with kind of big data algorithms, trying to actually update this and actually saying and so on. So in all these things, that's the approach you can be using. And you have a decency principle that you never go and take money away. You're not going to do like you should have known that you shouldn't receive the cash and so on, as typically in our social benefit systems work. That actually, if errors are made, you bank them. Still going to be so much more efficient than doing it ever exposed. So I think we can handle that. I love the question on political commitment. It's quite useful that this slide is there, There's a book there that you may want to read. It came out last year in paperback only a few weeks ago. And it's basically about fundamentally political commitment is all. And it's actually, if we don't think carefully about the nature of the politics, and I will actually say, and I may have misspoken a bit, because, the system to some extent ties politicians' hand, but it has to be their choice. So it's not about a kind of a technocratic outsiders decide this is going to work. It has to be a political choice. So if you want to have a system that works a bit better, there has to be something in it for them as well. So that's the first thing on local politics. You know, come on the geopolitics there as well. Actually, we have evidence that that's possible. Oh, we can go to Mexico, where in 1987 earthquake, Mexico City was, I think it was 30,000 people got killed, massive damage and so on. It brought in the politics of Mexico, it brought disasters there. It was always disasters, but it brought it home to the capital, to the elite. And actually, interestingly, it became the theme to run the elections on. And in fact, the leading party was kicked out. And the platform of the opposition was we're going to have a much better system of actually pre-arranged stuff that actually this doesn't happen. From risk reduction, from better enforced building codes to exposed responses that could do it. Okay? And so it became a politically salient thing. The system is called Fonden, is actually the funds that actually the pre-arranged finance for rebuilding. They work with a pre-agreed, politically pre-agreed plan of which infrastructure is the most important, which is not. So basically, when the money comes, you avoid the Nepal problem that you have to argue forever about which bridge I'm going to build first, and so on. But it's politically agreed what the plan we're making. So it's not as if there's some bunch of technocrats going to sit in some kind of modeling office and then tie these people's hands. It's still the politicians that need to decide. It worked very well in Mexico, because the latest, I think, I can't remember when it was. When was the last big earthquake? Was it 19 or 20 or so, the big Mexico one? And I remember there was a wonderful interview on Radio 4 with an opposition politician who was asking the usual questions. And who do you blame that there are 300 people killed? Who do you blame? People say the building codes are not being enforced and the whole kind of thing. And the guy said, no, wait a minute. Actually, I don't blame the government. You remember, 87, similar scale of earthquake, 30,000 people died, now 300 people died. We're actually making massive progress, and the building standards have improved dramatically. And you got even a journalist trying to get a politician saying what they like to say, blame the other politician. And there was a consensus about it. We did actually pretty well. It was actually a much better handled earthquake, including with pre-arranged finance, where they had basically bought cat bonds on the market to get, within days, money to do the reconstruction. It was actually kind of remarkable, but it needs the political thing. So I'm the first one to say, politics matters crucially for this, otherwise it doesn't work. You can't do it technocratically. And by the way, that's probably one of the problems in New York all the time, that they behave as if there's no politics while they're playing it all the time. So it's actually really centrally, and in this environment it is. Okay, quickly on, is there space for public giving? Well, actually, look, give them credit due where it is, give directly, totally reliant on cash transfers, Rory Stewart's outfit, in case you forgot the link with it. And so they're basically working with us on these things. They find it really attractive to actually make that case. And, yes, it needs to have a particular thing in the public horizon. DEC can still do what they usually does, and whenever there's a crisis, go on TV, because we know full well that only a tiny fraction of the money that gets raised by particular appeal from the Disaster Emergence Committee will ever go to that particular crisis. And the fine print is, we will use it for lots of good other reasons, and it's something like 10% or something only seems to be going to the particular crisis, because of course by the time you give the money, it's far too late to mobilize the money and so on and so on. So we can still play the game if we want to. But I think rational and reasonable NGOs can also use this and say, look, this is an alternative model of doing it. And we can actually, wouldn't you rather invest in resilient systems than actually having to every year saying this is the worst ever crisis and whatever. So I think I'm pretty hopeful on that.
So we are nearly running out of time, but then I'll ask Stefan just two, I think are just quite important questions.
There were two more hands that you didn't
Two more hands. Oh, me first. Very quick one. Very quick. We've got a lot of. We do a lot of work in terms of physical science modeling, tsunamis and probabilistic modeling, engineers. We've got a lot of research happening there. From a social scientist's point of view, what more do you want? How do you want us to sort of collaborate? How do you see more fruitful collaborations happening? And then we'll take the other two questions.
I just saw earlier 5 hands, so that's why I...
Okay, 5 hands?
No, there was a hand here and there, maybe.
Yes, Sangeeta here.
Thank you for the presentation, Stefan. Thank you so much. My name is Sangeeta Thiruvalimbu. I'm one of the PhD students here at IRDR. My question is more around the model where is there a possibility to imagine that the model can be flipped whereby the beneficiaries are not just at the end, it's almost like an oxymoron to say passive agency. They do have agency, but somehow in this particular model, they somehow feature at the end. But is there a way to think about a model where we do put people at the heart, as we think about like designing and planning, and also I guess yesterday in the humanitarian summit, what struck to me was how much of these interventions are sort of assuming this nation-state model, or much of the humanitarian funding also goes to national governments, which also means that you have to be recognized by the state, and especially for those affected who are not recognized as the legitimate actors, and that really constrains whether they will benefit from these projects or not. So I guess in short, I just want to say, is there a way to think about a model where it begins with people, as opposed to different actors, particularly politicians and others doing the planning? Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, just.
Sorry, more hands come, but I'll do it quick.
I'm Mary Gordon, PhD student at IRDR. And these are, apologies, it's quite a big question about concepts that you're using. So two that I noticed were kind of in the background, being agency and dignity. And if I heard correctly, you mentioned that there is no agency of the people affected when the flood occurs. And then later on in your presentation, you were talking about metric of measuring versus those who did receive finance and those who didn't. So I was sort of wondering if you could expand a bit on what you mean by agency in this sense and why people do or don't have it, how you've been measuring it, also from like a conceptual to a practical measuring side. And then the same with dignity, there is actually a paper that's really good by Jennifer Ward, I don't know if you know her, but about how you cannot give or take dignity from people. So how are you working with that? So in sum, how are you framing these two big concepts of dignity and agency within humanitarian and disaster research?
And there's this lady, quickly.
Maybe just one
Quickly.
more question.
I'll do it very quick.
You can make it
very quick. Hi, thanks. I'm Susanna Fisher. I'm a Principal Research Fellow in the department. So my question is again about the kind of politics and thinking about this parallel systems idea. We of course also have now parallel systems coming down for funds for climate change. And there's discussions now around addressing losses and damages and how we get funds down that way. So beyond the humanitarian system, I wondered if you could reflect a little bit. And if we've got these really great plumbing systems in place, like how could we build on these politics to kind of bring some of those other areas together?
Right. Big questions and has to be short answers. Your question on the science models, okay? So where the science models are typically least useful in practice is that the final link between the physical damage and the hydrological damage or whatever it is, all the models, linking it to what actually impacts on people's living standards and ability to act. There's so much weakness there that we can model whether the building will collapse, but you don't really have any sense of who is actually the people that are vulnerable in there. And there is a, relatively speaking, so much attention on the one and very little on the other one. And I think it's a big problem in the whole space, because in the end, whether we want to do it via, systems that I describe, or even just basic social protection or targeting systems, we need to have a sense of, come back to this problem, who are quote unquote, and big questions there, but who should we give support to, because we can't give it to everybody, and how much should we do it? And modeling, bringing that into the human dimension is actually a real limitation of a lot of these big models. And in practice, it limits, for example, it just creates a lot of opportunities for, say, insurance products that insure buildings or units, but actually very little that they can actually get, for example, that thinking underlying, say, social protection systems and so on, because we miss that thing. So I think that's where the biggest gap lies, and it's a hard one. The second one is there on the, putting people first. I have to be very careful here. There's a lot of language always in this space, and I've been long enough in the kind of more practical world of having to do it, is that, whenever people say, oh, it needs to be a human-centered model, I will want to ask, can you give me a sense of what I can do at scale carefully in doing this? Okay, and so there is this, yes, there is this sense of the nation state, largely there, and an attempt to, at the same time, attempt to build up more of this plumbing that is, the word interoperable is an important one here, because it means different groups can actually operate within it. And could talk in detail about the difference about, giving people a place in that system, and actually then what the nation state may decide who should be included or not. But if you have plumbing that is in principle interoperable, if you can't stop people from being excluded from simply having a mobile phone, you could actually already get quite a lot of things, for example, there. And I will be the first to say is that, there is a sense of passive inclusion, but in some sense, that's what we're talking about, all the other stuff that I would do in development is to actually saying, well, give people opportunities to build up their own lives. But we're talking about crisis systems, but actually when at some point outside support is needed, can we do it? On the other side, there's a whole series of things. How can we strengthen that they never need it and do the development work and so on? So, yeah, so there is this thing, but then it's about people, and then we get to dysfunctional states. So will the state decide you shouldn't be getting it, Bangladesh, Rohingya, or whatever, shouldn't you get it? I think that's where humanitarian system needs to be making its call. My problem with the humanitarian system is it wants to do everything. It wants to do drought in Malawi. For God's sake, get out of Malawi. That's not your task. But do what you just say. People that are non-legitimate, be there ready to do Syria. Do there the crisis situations where actually there's a real humanitarian principle at stake. But where you have a nation state that can potentially function okay, that's not where we should be building these systems from the international thing. And that's where you actually do it with government. And then, you come back to this legitimacy issues and so on there. But, this is in a way the structures we have that we can work with. If people then are really systematically excluded, then it becomes the space for where humanitarian system needs to come in. I actually keep on thinking humanitarian system should go back to its core business and not trying to do everything, okay? So, and that's actually one of the big problems, because that's where the humanitarian principles in principle applied, and not in sort of the basic things. I think climate and disaster things, it shouldn't be external agencies. It should be largely building up from countries and doing things. And then it comes to this question of the parallel systems. Yeah, scares the hell out of me. I mean, it's just, we basically, a lot of that stuff is, a whole legitimacy of the international system is gone away. And well, let's now have another one, because we can reinvent ourselves. We can reinvent the World Bank. We can reinvent the UN. Oh, we'll be doing that because it's all global public goods. No. This stuff is not global public goods. It's actually basically people, it's essentially private transfers to private individuals. This is not about the global, this mitigation stuff, yeah, fine, but this is other stuff. And so again, is this encroachment, this thinking, we're inventing agendas to redefine our own purpose again of these organizations that are outside. Not just try to build, and I'm actually quite positive, more and more countries show some commitment to have actually decent social protection systems. Let's build on top of that and help them to build this plumbing and avoid all that stuff. And then finally, the kind of conceptualization. Yes, I was very fast, and hopefully in the paper we talk a little bit more carefully. But I'm kind of want to be at this stage at least quite pragmatic, and the measurement is to do as much as you can work with when you have to call someone and deal with it. But the mapping is, there's at least a bit more agency, there's a little bit less passivity because you give people opportunity to act. For me, the agency is basically giving us a space, an opportunity to take actions that are that's their decision and not someone else's decision. That's the minimal amount. Can we give agency? I don't know, but we can create systems that allow people to have more agencies. That's different from giving it or taking it away. The dignity part, I take your point as well. It's the thing. I took the language actually from some of these humanitarian evaluations that want to actually say the minimal amount it is that, but maybe I should have used the word agency as well. I want to give even people in refugee camps a bit of choice of how they actually build up their lives, rather than telling you, this is the ration of food you get, and by the way, if I see you reselling it, you're really going to be excluded the next time. That's what I mean by what you want to go away from. Okay, I think that's it, no? Thank you very much.
Thank you.